Good evening, everybody. Happy deadline day. Isn't it lovely to watch it with your feet up, knowing that Norwich City have completed their business with 24 hours to go or so, as it was last night, as their final bit of incoming business was done. That, of course, was Ozan Kabak joining on a season-long loan from Schalke. We will discuss that as well as all of this transfer window's comings and goings, and there's been plenty to get our teeth into. What there is probably to expect this evening, and there probably is a small little kind of bits and bobs that Norwich City will do just to trim the edges of their squad that we'll kind of discuss in a little bit more detail. If you've got any comments or questions, do fire them in and we'll answer as many as we can. As you can see, myself, Dave Freezer and Paddy Davitt here with you to discuss everything, even if it's not Norwich City related and you want to bring it up on deadline day, then do get in and we'll have a whirl, although we can't promise any sort of insight, but that's the drill, isn't it? Dave, let's come to you first. How are you doing deadline day? As I said there, it's probably nice for us to watch the chaos unfold everywhere else, really, and sit back knowing that Norwich City have got their ducks in a row and kind of, well, Stuart Webber's out of office is on, essentially.
It is very nice. I'd imagine if it's possible, Stuart will be on a beach somewhere already, because he'll be well happy with his work, won't he? And just wanting to get his feet up. And I think, as we've said a few times before, it's kind of a matter of personal pride for him, isn't it? He doesn't like doing things on deadline day. Thinks it sort of shows a certain degree of unorganisation or a lack of preparation. And they would certainly have liked to have got Norman a lot earlier in the window. As we know, they were chasing him for a while. Kabak seems like it's one that became possible a bit later in the window. But ultimately, if the transfer window actually goes beyond the opening games of the season, then that's going to happen to a certain extent, isn't it? There was the Euros this summer. Without a tournament, then you would have thought that it makes sense to get the deadline closed before the actual football kicks off. But anyway, it's lovely to sit here and not be fretting over what might and might not happen, because that's where we've been the majority of transfer windows in the past.
Yeah, Pad, let's come to you, because I think in terms of positions that we really spoke about all summer and have been speaking about all summer, that's Norwich City as a job well done, isn't it? They've strengthened in all areas that they need to strengthen. I mean, we'll probably broaden out and give our opinions on certain areas of the squad and the players they have added. But in terms of how Stuart Webber and the club will be feeling at the moment, do you think they'll be sitting back and reflecting on what has been a very successful window?
Absolutely, yeah. And to be honest, we take our temperature because that's part of the job from the social media reaction. And I wouldn't say universal, because that's not the society we live in. But the vast majority of Norwich fans that I have seen reacting to these deals, particularly the burst over the bank holiday with Matthias Normann and then obviously Ozan Kabak, are almost ecstatic. I would put the mood level at, and if that's good enough for the majority of the Norwich fan base, then you can rest assured that'll be more than good enough for Stuart Webber, his recruitment people, Daniel Farker, who's been very hands-on with a lot of these signings. So, but of course, it's there's a two-way now. It's kind of, there's all the signings. We think we've done a very good window. To take Stuart at his measure, is the 11 and the squad better than when they started way back? 2 weeks after Barnsley, whatever it was. I think it probably is, but we won't know now, and we can't really judge it until we get into playing games with all these new shiny accompaniments, and that starts with Arsenal the other side of the international break. But it's hard not to think that Norwich will be far better now moving forward as those players bed in, as they adapt, as they gel, as we progress through the season. The big imponderable still, despite having a very, very good window, is will that be enough to achieve their objective of staying in the division? Time will tell. But they're certainly better equipped to be able to do that now, I think, and that is a testament to the work they've done. Purely in monetary terms, it's a window unlike any other. Norwich have never spent this amount of money, even subtracting the Emi Buendia fee they got from Aston Villa. And for those reasons, I don't think it'd be interesting to get the sense from these Norwich fans on the broadcast tonight. But I can't think there'll be too many who don't think Norwich have, quote, had a go, and that's all you can ask for.
Well, maybe unless they work for a national radio station, at least. I think everyone else will certainly be aware of what Norwich City have done this summer. Let's kind of reflect on the two that they have brought in kind of the last 48 hours. Let's start with Matthias Normann then, Dave. And we were kind of sat on Saturday and we were warned that the next sort of 48 hours or so could be fairly manic. And that turned out to be the case. Matthias Normann, I mean, we've spoken so much and we'll speak so much during this broadcast about Norwich City's patience and maybe that being a different approach to how they've really tackled transfer windows in the past, when it's been kind of about working their way through targets very quickly and trying to get players in the door as soon as possible, as close to the start of pre-season as possible. This has been a marked change to certainly the way Stuart Webber and Norwich City have done things in the last few seasons. Matthias Normann is another one that represents that, isn't he? Norwich City's interest is long-standing. It was a player that they've wanted probably since the title was secured against Barnsley at the end of the season. In terms of a deal and a position, how essential was it for Norwich City that they did get that defensive midfielder in before the deadline closed at in a few hours' time?
Absolutely pivotal. Yeah, I think we were discussing that 3-4 weeks ago on the podcast, weren't we? And so are the vast majority of the Norwich City bubble, really. Oliver Skipp was a massive part of the success last season. Grant Hanley and Ben Gibson wouldn't have looked as secure if they didn't have Skipp in front of them. And yes, they probably held out hope a bit too long. The injury complicated things a bit, didn't it, as to whether he would get in at Spurs. But then once Nuno had arrived and once he was basically fit enough for the start of pre-season, it was pretty quickly becoming clear that Skipp wasn't going to be coming back. He may well have said to Stuart and Daniel, look, if I'm going to go out on loan again, I'll happily come back here. But he has now started all 3 games for Tottenham. They're top of the Premier League. I said somewhere it popped up that Newcastle were interested in him today, didn't they? I mean, no chance. Tottenham aren't letting him out now, are they? He's helped them get off to probably their best. Well, isn't it the first time ever that Tottenham have finished a weekend top and Arsenal bottom, something like that? I saw it on Match of the Day. But in Norwich terms, yeah, Norman was someone that they had on their list. They knew that there was this potential for it, but they always knew it was probably a difficult deal and maybe even one that was going to be beyond them. But as the season has progressed, I think they have realised that they've got to get that done, that he's the man that they want. And stylistically, I think it's interesting as to what Daniel Farke wants. If we look at either end of the spectrum in terms of an Ollie Skipp and from what we've seen from Billy Gilmour so far this season, I think it shows that Daniel knows he needs that defensive midfielder. He knows that he needs someone that's going to provide protection, but he also wants someone that can maybe do a bit more with the ball. And with Norman, from all that we've seen of him, and you're always wary of the YouTube supercuts or the usual things that we say, he looks like he's got an eye for a pass. He looks like he can spray it about a bit. He looks like he likes to get forward and crack a few shots from the edge of the box. So this may well be the evolution of what Daniel Farke sees that deep line midfielder being, because we have seen that evolve through his 4 seasons, haven't we? The Tetty and Tribal combination. He tried Tribal there on his own at times. Leitner and Tribal, McLean and Tribal. We've seen quite a few combinations and he's never seemed to quite be happy with it. But then Skipp and McLean, or Rupp when he was fit and firing, that seemed to be the best balance that he'd found for quite a while. So if he's going to go with a 4-3-3 or a 4-3-2-1, whatever you want to call it, for the time being, then he needs a lot from that deep line midfielder.
Yeah, he definitely does. And hopefully Norman is the man that can fulfill that role. And as you say, certainly all the noises that we've seen, and there have been various pieces about him written in the past and his sort of tactical role, it all seems fairly positive. So let's hope we see that once he does return from Norway and joins up with Norwich. Pad, does their pursuit of Matthias Normann kind of encapsulate what we were talking about in terms of patience? I mean, it was a long pursuit. They were probably rebuffed by player and club at different stages during that. If we're talking about their interest sort of being backdated to April, that's a long time to pursue a player. Does that really show kind of the marked difference between how they've approached this window and perhaps how they approached the window 2 years ago?
100%, Connor. And to be fair, we were sat in a room with Stuart Webber after the end of the last season where he made that point that was one of the takeaways. Bit of cosmos, yeah, it's got to be done. Well, I mean, it's fairly obvious that side, it's fairly obvious there. But I've had people in the supermarket stop me and say, "That's a nice Norwich sock, Paddy. Look a bit closer." But there you go. Anyway, I digress. But
It's yellow and green though, isn't it? So
yeah, of course, yeah. Well, hence why you're sharp, Connor. but yeah,
no
absolutely.
ties on him.
Let's move on.
that's what these are for.
Yeah, let's move on. But absolutely, I mean, he referenced it in terms of not panic, but when they didn't get maybe what they bracketed 2 seasons ago, bearing in mind they had a far smaller pot of money, and their room for manoeuvre was probably a lot more limited. But nevertheless, when they were getting maybe some negativity or not the encouragement for their targets, they moved on to the next one and the next one, and down and down and down the list went. And if you were being uncharitable, you'd say, well, what does that tell you for Patrick Roberts, Ralph Farman, Ibrahim Amadou, et al.? But there you go. So this time around, yeah, we're talking about Norman here. You go back and look at Daniel Farke's quotes after Brandon Williams arrived. Yes, I know that's a loan, not a permanent deal, but again, one they'd worked on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Billy Gilmore, you can be sure the groundwork was going in there. One that didn't happen, but they'd pursued it for quite some time. Chris Aya, until it got to the point where it was very obvious that Celtic were not going to budge for whatever valuation they had on the guy. But again, even before the end of last season, the wheels were starting to turn on that one. So, yeah, I think, and Norman is probably the most extreme example that they have waited and waited when maybe, given the first 3 games and the whole talk around, as Dave has mapped out there, they didn't have that Ollie Skip type presence. And clearly Billy Gilmore isn't that. And maybe it was a little bit unfair to ask him, to take that burden on. But they still, if they clearly felt they were going to get some encouragement for Norman, the longer they waited and waited, they were willing to stay true to that target, and it's paid off. And now we all hope, as I said in my introductory comments, that he looks like he fits the criteria. But let's see him now. He didn't really play well. He didn't play at all when he was at Brighton in England before. I know he's a much younger man. He said he's found himself playing out in Russia, and by all accounts, he's probably a bit too good for the Russian league. So it's a big step up, as it is with Kabak, and you just hope that these guys are upgrades on what Norwich have. I think you feel they have to be, for all the reasons already stated. But I just think it's a lot of pressure now to put on this young man, and he looks clearly very confident. You see him on his social media accounts. I don't think he's a man who lacks for self-belief, put it that way. You've got to have something about you to have a silvery blue type of haircut anyway, whatever shade we're going with on that one. But it is asking a lot for him to come in and immediately, Oliver Skip who. So I'm going to reserve a little bit of judgment, but he's the one they feel is capable of taking it on. And the fact that they waited as long as they did, you have to back their judgment. So let's see if he's as good as they think he is, because clearly they wouldn't have waited this long, almost to the end of the window, to bring him in if they didn't think, yes, he's our number 1 target in that position. We're going to wait. So proof will be in the pudding with everything to do with these signings. Yes, they've got the business done, and hat tip to Stuart and his team. But ultimately, can Daniel now? I think the focus firmly shifts to Daniel. Can Daniel now meld this group into an effective Premier League outfit week in, week out? And if they do that, then I think we could have a good season ahead.
If I had a body like Matthias Normann, I think I'd be posting it all over Instagram as well, to be honest.
Still time. You're only a young man. Get yourself in the gym, mate.
Definitely not. Hold that thought on where sort of Daniel Farke is within this, because we'll come back to this. We'll also be getting the guys. I haven't told them about this yet, so I'm sort of preparing you guys now. We'll also come to you for maybe some good deadline day stories in years gone by that maybe you guys have got. I'm thinking probably Yannick Wildskut. There are probably several others as well, maybe ones that haven't happened for various reasons. We'll try and get those a little bit later, so I'll put you on warning for that. Let's move on then to Ozan Kabak. He is Norwich City's final incoming bit of business, on loan from Schalke. An option to buy next summer if all goes well, presumably if Norwich stay in the Premier League, given the fee involved. He's a player that has a lot of excitement around him, was on loan at Liverpool last season, was very highly rated at Schalke and Stuttgart before that, played for Galatasaray in the Champions League when he was 18 years old. So much pedigree and experience for a 21-year-old. Dave, how impressive of a signing is this for Norwich City, given his pedigree, what I've outlined there, but also some of the clubs that were linked to him this summer? Torino were pressing hard. Newcastle was said to have been interested. Norwich seem to have, as they tend to do under Stuart Webber, timed their run to perfection.
Yeah, It is certainly one that is potentially pretty exciting. I think with him being 21 and the way his career's gone so far, I don't want to sort of pin Norwich's survival hopes on him or anything, because we'll have to see how it develops. But he's had quite the career, considering he doesn't turn 22 until March, I think it is. As you say, playing for Galatasaray, which comes with a heck of a lot of pressure, to be doing that at 18 and playing in the Champions League. Then he goes to Stuttgart. They get relegated. So he goes to Schalke, 6 months, has one season there. Then 6 months into the next season, he's at Liverpool while Schalke are absolutely imploding. He has a bit of a disciplinary scrape, shall we call it. He got a 1 game ban upgraded to a 5 game ban because he was sanctioned for spitting at a player. He insists that he didn't mean to do it. And if you look at the video, you can sort of see where he's coming from. He says the TV angle was bad. I wasn't meaning to spit at him. I was just spitting, basically. But they weren't convinced. He got his 5 game ban. He was very apologetic, insisted it will never happen again. He'll be more careful, etc. So it wasn't like he went up to someone 2 foot into their face and just really went for it aggressively or anything like that. But he does that. He goes to Liverpool, and that goes there at a really tough time, doesn't he? When they're in defensive injury crisis, Matip, Gomez, and of course Van Dijk all out, which is basically why they lost the title last season, wasn't it? And after a bit of a shaky start, he seemed to win the Liverpool fans over. And just as things were going well, he played in the Champions League last 16 and the quarterfinal, and he gets a bit of an injury and is ruled out. And there's a bit at Pinken.com, which I pulled together earlier, Jurgen Klopp's thoughts on him at the end of last season when the local media was saying, well, are you going to sign Kabak? He said he's been absolutely incredible. Ultimately, they decided to go and sign Ibrahima Konate at Red Bull Leipzig, who was a more experienced player, £36 million player. And they maybe didn't think that the deal that they'd negotiated was quite worth it for Kabak. They just needed defenders. They signed is it Andrew Davies from Preston as well, didn't they?
Ben Davies.
Ben Davies, sorry, yeah. So they were desperate for defenders, weren't they? And in the end, Kabak ended up working out pretty well. Him and Nat Phillips, their academy product, ended up forming a pretty decent central defensive partnership. So if he can build on that Premier League momentum, at 21, the Norwich could very quickly have a serious asset on their hands. Already 12 caps for Turkey, and we saw how much money Ben Godfrey went. If you are a progressive ball-playing, but still strong defensively centre-back, you can be worth a lot of money very quickly. We've seen with John Stones, Harry Maguire, etc., etc. A couple of comments, and I'll bounce one back to you, Connor, before we come to Paddy. But somebody asked about his international duty. Here it is from William. He is joining up with Turkey, but Turkey are on the red list, and they're also playing Montenegro. I think it's tomorrow night, who are also on the red list. So I've asked the club about this, and basically they've said at the moment they're in talks with the Turkish Association, as I'm sure a lot of clubs are, because the Premier League had said that players weren't to play in countries that are on the red list. So Milot Rashica, for instance, isn't going to play for Kosovo in Georgia. But will then play in their other games that follow. So we'll have to see what happens with Kabak, because he's literally only just become a Premier League player. He was due to be playing in those games. The Argentinian lads at Villa, including Emi Buendia, have found a loophole, haven't they? And I suspect that most players involved in the Premier League will find a loophole and will play for their countries. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens with that. But specifically on Kabak, Tom asked this. If I bounce it back to you, Connor. Hi, guys. Will we play Kabak in a 3, or will he possibly replace Gibson or Hanley? So what are both of your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I was going to come to Paddy on just this point, actually. And it's interesting for me that I think throughout the summer, the kind of line has been, we'll only sign a centre-back if they represent a step up to the options that we already have. So that doesn't imply that we're going to see a switch to a 3, and that would probably also include Norwich losing a player at the other end of the pitch, and then it's about how you kind of restructure that, and that to me would feel quite a big jump from what they're trying to do at the moment with this 4-3-3. But again, I think we spoke about it on the podcast to an extent, where you never know, the possibility of, or signing Norman may open the possibility to doing something a little bit different tactically, because they haven't really had that midfield that they can rely on defensively. And there may be a little period where Daniel Farke just tries to work Norman out and to make sure he's fully got his trust before he can absolutely depend on him. And maybe we'll see him revert to the 4-2-3-1 or whatever. But at this stage, I don't really see a free. I don't think it's completely off the cards, but I must admit I don't see it completely. I was going to come to you on this point, Pad, because that has been the line from the club in terms of they would only sign a centre-back if it was a marked improvement on what they had, so i.e. Ben Gibson and Grant Hanley. So where do you kind of see Kabak entering that debate, and how do you think it kind of shifts how Daniel Farke might look to play in the Premier League?
Well, I mean, ultimately, he will play, and it's who plays alongside him for the reason you just stated there. They see him quite clearly as an upgrade on their existing central defensive stocks. And I think it will be too. And if it's essentially then Hanley or Gibson, I think it's going to be Hanley. And I know he's a right-sided centre-back, but I think the feeling inside the club is that he can operate on that left-hand berth. And I for various reasons, I don't see Hanley being, if you're Daniel Farke, deferring to Ben Gibson. So, and let's be honest, I think you might have made the point earlier, both of them have had disrupted pre-seasons. So, you need to come a little bit of slack. Gibson obviously coming back off the ankle issue that curtailed his season last season. Big Grant goes away with Scotland, the Euros, playing very well. Final game gets an issue. And then he was one of those who had to self-isolate for corona purposes. So, by no means have they had the perfect pre-seasons, but I think it was evident, Leicester on Saturday, and that is a valuable point you make as well, that any debate about how well or not those two have done so far has to accept that they haven't had a Skip/Norman offering him a little bit of protection. So I think we need to caveat that with any discussion of their performances so far. But for me, it was a bit concerning, Ben Gibson's lack of pace at the top level when he was exposed in wide areas, both when he tried to track out to shut down Ricardo Pereira and got nowhere near. And there was one or two other instances where it was almost last-ditch type of blocks on the likes of Vardy and Maddison. And that would concern me a little bit, that what we're going to have there is week in, week out, if he gets isolated, you'd be a bit concerned. So I must confess, I don't know if Kabak is a speedster. I haven't seen enough of him, but I'm assuming that he is an athlete. You look at him, he looks a powerful player with that natural athleticism as well as decent on the ball. So right here, right now, happy to be proved wrong, but I think it'll be Gibson making way. I don't see him immediately going to a 3 for the reasons you stated there, Connor. I think that's something maybe from opponent to opponent and within games that it might allow him to do, but I don't see this as the beginning of a new dawn with 3 base formation and then wing backs, because I think that's injecting too many variables at this stage. It's trying to meld a system and a style of play within a new group of players, essentially, and bed that in. So for those reasons, I think it'll be still the 2. And I would expect it'll be Gibbo missing out, and then it'll be up to Hanley and Kabak, if it is, to prove that they can play both individually and collectively at a level that ensures that they are more often than not the starting 2.
Yeah, what Kabak's arrival does mean is that Norwich now have competition in every single department, whether that's up front with Timu Pukki and Josh Sargent, or at the back with probably 2 of those 3 starting on a regular basis. So that is going to drive the competition up a little bit. I did see a comment a minute ago, I think it was from Ben on YouTube, about elite athletes being on the exemptions job list for the red list countries. That isn't the case. The Premier League have released a statement saying that the clubs will block players who are going to play in red countries, essentially because of the hotel quarantine and the concern for fitness. The Argentinian lads have kind of defied that, but as Dave said there, have found a loophole in that they're on their way back to the UK. They're going to isolate on like a Croatian island where they're going to be allowed to train and then fly back to the UK, so they don't lose out on any fitness, which is something that everyone else would be able to do if they went abroad. So it's always good. Pat, just to throw it back to you on Kabak very quickly, because I've got a sense we may be talking about something else in just a moment. That deal and his arrival, do you think that was as quick as perhaps it progressed? I mean, it initially came from a Sunday Mail report on Sunday evening that Norwich were probably interested in signing him along with Newcastle. And then we skip to Monday morning where he's actually arrived in Norfolk on a plane. So is this Norwich sensing an opportunity and completely going for it? Or do you think there were probably weeks of work put into that deal?
Somewhere in between, Connor, I think. Yeah, I don't think that Stuart Webber woke up on Sunday morning and thought, my God, did you see
the Sunday Mail?
Yeah, did you see those two against Leicester? We need to act. I don't think it was kind of that. As you rightly say, Connor, I'm getting distracted by a certain piece of news that it could be dropping at any moment. But by the same token, it sounds like, we know they started off the summer and it was Aya, but that didn't obviously happen. And as a result, they had to move it on. And, Adebayo at Fulham, he was looked at. Borneau, Cologne, was it? Off the top of my head, he was looked at. Neither of those sufficiently, tickled their fancy, it's safe to say, because I'm sure deals could have been done if they were willing to progress on those two fronts. And that tells me that probably there was an acceptance that Kabak could be available, and they could probably, again, what we said earlier in the broadcast, bide your time, keep your cards close to your chest, and play the waiting game. And obviously, once I think Torino had a little nibble last week, and the player, it sounds to me like a lot of it was driven by the player who wanted to get back to the Premier League after having had a taste of it with Liverpool. He was offered to numerous Premier League clubs, I understand. Clearly, nobody showed as firm an interest as Norwich. And then once they did, I think it's pretty easy to put that type of deal together if all parties are amenable. And as a result, I think he said himself he was on a plane at 5 a.m. yesterday, arrived into England, slightly delayed, but then commenced his medical formalities, signed his contract, and he's holding up a Norwich shirt, some point in the afternoon. So I think with a lot of these deals, the legwork is what takes the time. But once it's a green for go, then it happens very quickly.
Absolutely. The clock has just ticked over to 6 o'clock, so I think we can say now that Norwich City have come to an agreement with Tim Klose over his contract. He's departed mutually a year or so early on his deal. Of course, probably not a massive shock given he spent the entirety of last season on loan at FC Basel. There was an option to make that deal permanent in that loan agreement that wasn't taken up by FC Basel, and essentially now his contract has been freed up. He's been training away from the first team group. He can go and join a club outside of the transfer window, which I'm sure will be probably in everyone's thinking, and I'm sure most Norwich fans will wish Tim Klose the best. 5 years he was at the club, signed in January 2016 for an initial £8.5 million from Wolfsburg. Was pretty well, tremendous really, between when he signed to that day he got the injury against Crystal Palace, which essentially derailed Norwich City's survival campaign. He then remained and stayed with the club in the Championship. Many expected him to go. That first season was very difficult. He probably got saved a little bit by Daniel Farke and his role in that team. A bit more ball playing probably suited him a lot more. Of course, injuries have kind of scuppered him throughout. I think Dave is sorting out the little bits and pieces of that. So I'll come back to you then, Pad, on Tim Klose.
Yeah.
I mean, as good a player he was, and we certainly saw that in patches of his Norwich City career, is it fair to say that ultimately injuries probably got the better of him in the end? I remember that Project Restart period where he was in there, but he was practically playing on one leg, wasn't he?
And to be fair, Daniel Farke said subsequently wasn't fair on him at all. He wasn't anywhere near fit. I mean, he pretty much missed the whole of that season. That was the season he'd done his knee, was it his ankle, at Stevenage, wasn't it? In the League Cup. And pretty much from that point in early August, was it, to the restart period, he'd played no football at all, but needs must. Norwich's chronic central defensive issues came back to haunt them again at the back end of that season. And when they really needed the team to step up and they needed Tim Klose to step up, his body just wasn't, Premier League battle hardened, and that wasn't his fault. It was just the situation that everybody found themselves in. So I think we can overlook that period. For me, though, the injury that really scuppered him was 2 seasons prior, that first 6 months when he was brought in to keep that team, the Alex Neil team, in that Premier League. And by Jove, how good was he in those first few months? He looked to steal at 8.5 million from Wolfsburg. Such a leader, such a cultured central defender. We've talked a lot here about central defenders and what Norwich have now got in the building. But my God, he was a very classy operator, suited to the Premier League more so than the Championship. he said himself that it was quite an eye opener getting battered by Daryl Murphy at Portman Road early the following season, and as a result, I think he preferred the more refined air of the Premier League, and that suited him. But sadly, he got that injury at Palace. I think it was. He did his knee originally, and that was the end of him, and that was also the end of Norwich in the Premier League that season. And what ifs? Who knows? If he'd have stayed fit, Norwich had stayed up that season, we might still be talking about Tim Klose as Norwich's main man central defensively, because he was certainly more than good enough. But it is a shame. But I've just put a tweet out. I mean, we'll always have Ipswich, won't we? That's what he'll be remembered for. That celebration, that maniacal celebration in front of the Barclay. And what a lovely fella, really genuine guy. We all saw how he interacted on social media with fans. I can guarantee now, as we're speaking, that the outpouring of love and affection from the Norwich fans towards him will underline, a little bit like with Marco Stiepermann early in the summer. I'm pretty sure, how closely those players were taken to the hearts and the affections of Norwich fans. So it is sad, but that's football cycle. Certainly at the top level, there can't be any room for sentiment now. Certainly what Norwich are trying to achieve and go on to achieve. So you wish him all the best. And, I saw a few interviews with him where he was one of these who was sort of hinting that him and his family loved it so much here that, maybe they would sort of post-football sort of either have a base here or actually base themselves here. And I hope that comes to pass, and that maybe what's happened in his, what happened in terms of on the pitch in the last sort of 12 months or so hasn't soured his affection for Norfolk. I'm sure that wouldn't be the case. But lovely fella, great player in his prime. But ultimately time moves on. So we wish him all the best. And I look forward now to see what his football career holds, or whether he feels maybe it's time to hang up the boots. It'll be interesting to see where he goes next.
Yeah, 33 years of age. So probably closing his football career. We saw him on his Instagram on a flight to Switzerland. So this maybe isn't a massive shock, but I think we can see from the kind of feeling of the comments that have come in that he's a player that was well liked by both supporters and his fellow pros as well. And I think it's fair to say at his stage of his career, he does need to be playing football, doesn't he? Dave, I'll come to you then on Tim. As I say, a really popular figure, as Pad says, someone that will probably ultimately be remembered for that goal against Ipswich. But from a business perspective, Norwich City started this summer with probably 4 players that they needed to shift: Mo Leitner, Tom Tribal, Josip Drmic, and obviously Tim Klose as well. We sit here with a few hours left in the window. All 4 have obviously Josip Drmic still technically contracted to the club, but on loan away at Rijeka with his contract up next season essentially. So that is essentially permanent. To have sorted those 4 players out and to get them largely off the wage bill is something that Stuart Webber probably would have been keen to do this window.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense just to have none of that uncertainty around, none of those players sort of hanging around in the background. I don't think we've really had any suggestion that any of them are bad characters. I mean, certainly not Tim Klose. He's a huge, bubbly character, isn't he, on the whole? The Josh Murphy falling out of the boat and then making sure he got back in again and all that sort of stuff. He's a top bloke, Tim Klose. And he's been brutally honest about the way he came into football, hasn't he, in recent years as well, about how he had this sort of troubled upbringing where he was, what was the line? He was asleep on a park bench, drunk when he was 15 or something like that, wasn't he? And he was in a real bad place before he met the woman that turned out to be his wife, and she basically sort of saved his life and things like that. And he's gone on to have a good career. He did well at Wolfsburg, played in the Champions League, and unfortunately, things have, gone off the boil for him. But this mutual agreement, as you've teed up there, as we've seen with a few of the players, allows him to pursue a deal a little more easily. Tom Tribal signed for Hanover, I think, within 24 hours of his Norwich contract being cancelled, didn't it, or being announced at the very least. So having all those loose ends tied up is good, because there's a lot of players on the books. Drmic's sort of still on the books, isn't he? He's out on loan for the season, but he isn't going to be getting another contract at Norwich. I looked earlier, didn't I? 6 goals in 9 games Drmic has got. I had to check to make sure that he wasn't back in the Switzerland squad. And Stiepermann, equally. Sometimes in football, you just reach a point where it makes sense for both parties to part ways. Louis Thompson, all came down to his injuries, didn't it? Farker and Webber really liked him, They gave him that long contract, but he just couldn't get fit enough to be sort of relevant to Norwich City's squad. And it's the same with Tim. And I think he probably took a lot of flack during that project restart period where he was playing on after that serious injury and struggling really. And he was pretty open about the fact that he was struggling with it, didn't he? And then we saw him and Hernandez and Pookie, was it, in the dugout, sat there looking really down in the dumps while Max and Todd were on the pitch close to tears because relegation had been confirmed by that awful 4-0 defeat to West Ham. And he cared about the club. There's no doubt about that. And I think, like with Stiepermann and Tribal, maybe Leitner not to quite the same extent because he disappeared a bit more quickly, there will be a strong connection there forever, and he will be remembered as someone who did a lot for the club. No more so than, I'm just seeing it actually tweeted just as I say it, that goal against Ipswich, the equaliser, which was just a magic moment, wasn't it? It was the oh no, when are they ever going to beat them? Which will never be forgotten, will it? And yeah, I'm sure all Norwich fans will wish Tim Klose all the best and hope that he can just find one more club to enjoy his football a bit before he starts to wind down.
Yeah, hopefully that's in Switzerland as well, and he can kind of go home and enjoy some time with his family as well, as he did last season. I think he was probably slightly disappointed not to have got that permanent deal at Basel. That would have been perfect for all parties, but now he gets an opportunity to do that. I know lots of people are speaking, and Neil has said it there, and as you mentioned, a few people have said it on social media, that goal against Ipswich. I'll tell you what I remember about Tim Klose, as well as obviously the goal against Ipswich, in that epic game at Carrow Road on Boxing Day when Norwich came back to draw 3-3 with Nottingham Forest. His nutmeg on the edge of the box that just put Hernandez through. I mean, there's not many big, tall centre-backs that you'd see nutmeg the ball in that situation. So I think that probably showed his technical ability. And Pad, just finally on Tim Klose, I mean, we kind of mentioned injuries maybe scuppering his progress to an extent. And I mean, 5 years, 100 games isn't a huge deal, to be completely honest. But he's someone that Daniel Farke really liked from the moment that he stepped into Norwich City.
That's actually a fantastic point, Connor, because he, more than any other player that Daniel encountered when he first got there, was that bridge. Obviously, probably the fact that, you know, the Swiss-German element, and was able to converse with Daniel and his backroom team that had come in, but not only the language barrier, but just as a senior presence in that dressing room. I'm sure he was a massive, massive sounding board for Daniel when, as we know, that was a very tough first season for him, finished below Ipswich. Who would have ever thought that was possible? And I'm sure in that season, Daniel would have learnt so much in a very short period of time. And a lot of that would have been down to Tim Klose, who'd been through it and understood the differences between maybe the Bundesliga and German football. And the environment that he'd come into, and maybe opened Daniel's eyes to many of the facets. And obviously, I probably won't get to speak to Daniel now much before Arsenal, but when we do, we'll ask him about Tim Klose, and I would guarantee he would make the same points, that not just as a player and his ability at that point, when he was still very, very much a key player for him, but just in terms of off the field. And as I say, you know, when we got off this broadcast tonight, the amount of current and former Norwich players will be queuing up on social to thank him for his time speaks volumes.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I'm going to read this comment from Matt, which sums it up and probably prompts the last question on Klose. He said, the best thing about those players, Tribal, Leitner, Klose, Vrancic, Teti, etc., they helped build the success that Norwich are experiencing now. They were the foundations that this was all built on. He said the supporters owe them a huge debt of gratitude, coming and building the philosophy, the grounded, humble, hard-working approach that we see now. Dave, just to throw that across to you finally on Tim Klose, Chris Gorham wrote, in his column for us this week about there being almost this being the second cycle of Daniel Farke and Stuart Webber's reign at Norwich City, that we've kind of seen the German influx, if you want to label it like that. They weren't all German, some of them were. Klose, obviously Swiss international. This now seems like we're seeing kind of the second cycle of that with Rashica Zolis, players who are now sort of taking contracts up to 2024. Do you think that's kind of a fair reflection of where Norwich City are at the moment, kind of between cycles of players and cycles of kind of transfer approaches?
Yeah, Webelution 2.0, I think Chris deemed it as, didn't he? So yeah, that can't be forgotten. And also what shouldn't be overlooked is that first half of 2018-19, Klose was excellent, wasn't he? Before he got his injury, he was a big part of that team. And I've said it before, the 4-1 win at Swansea, I always remember it mainly because I'd spent that. I was very fortunate to spend the sort of 10 days or so in Tampa with the squad ahead of that Swansea game. And before the break and before they'd gone to Tampa and had that warm weather training, it was the Millwall 4-3, wasn't it? And they managed to somehow win that game and stay top of the table. And I was terrified of them coming back from Tampa and losing that game at Swansea and everyone banging on about Tampa being to blame. So I was quite nervous about that game. And they were superb that day. It was probably Leitner's best game in a Norwich shirt, other than maybe the Newcastle game in the Premier League. And I always felt like there was a supply line there. It was Krul, Klose, Leitner, Steeperman, Pookie, with some very good players around them, Buendia, etc. So, yeah, I think that's the best football he played for the club. Less so the one that we'll never forget, Pad, the 5-0 at Brighton when he tried that ridiculous pirouette on the ball on the halfway line, when Alex Neil was absolutely furious, wasn't he? So he had some real ups and downs along the way. But yeah, those guys have been the foundation of it. And more than that, I don't think it's just on the pitch. I think it was off the pitch, wasn't it? It was the culture. It was all the Germans. It was the Farker waves. It was the sort of cultural shift at the club of all these overseas players that came in and brought a new flavour to it and a new connection for the fans. And the big characters like Tim and Zimbo were a big part of all that. And yeah, they won't be forgotten. And I do think, I'm sure that the club won't miss the trick that at some point when it's possible to bring all these guys back for a big, on the pitch farewell, a proper farewell. Maybe there'll even be another sort of Russ v Wes game at some point, because there's a lot of players that have left, haven't they, and who haven't been able to say goodbye properly, or even players that the fans didn't get to see really on the pitch. Skip, Godfrey, Tete, Vrancic, Leitner, Steeperman, Tribal. There's loads of them. You could probably fill one team at the very least of the players who've departed in that sort of scenario. So yeah, it is goodbye for now, but I'm sure we will see them all again, and I'm sure they will all at some point, hopefully through us, speak to the fans and reflect on the good times.
Absolutely, yeah. We wish Tim well, and it is going to be interesting to see where he ends up. Pad, we speak about there of almost this being kind of the second generation of the Webber Farker era, if that's how you want to label it. Do you see this one being slightly different in the type of players that Norwich City have recruited and attracted? They've tended to be younger, perhaps have higher reputations. Obviously, that comes because of the difference in where the club has got to, rather than where they were when it was inherited by Stuart Webber and Daniel Farker. But do you see a group of players now that for 3 or 4 years, providing, of course, Norwich can get Premier League survival this season, which is easier said than done, but this being a group of players that can really grow together, and not just grow collectively and individually, but also grow the club as well?
Absolutely, and the strategic nature that Stuart Webber particularly, but also Daniel now, with each long contract that he signs and his lieutenants, it is. How often do we hear the mid to longer term? It influences a lot of their planning. It isn't about, of course, it's about winning games of football, but what they're trying to do is almost break that cycle that everything is so short-termism, and it's very hard to do at the elite end of professional football with all the pressures and the demands for instant success. But part of that is that evolutionary approach to how you put a squad together, and it's very hard in this day and age because the reality is we'll pick one. Zolis, lives up to the expectations and goes on to be as good as Daniel thinks he can be. Then the reality is there will be clubs with far deeper pockets who can offer him probably better footballing opportunities, who will come and maybe not come that far down the line. And then, you're having to go again and just tweak it again. But I think fundamentally, if they could get a core of players who could stay together, are good enough this season, so as you say, Connor, stay in the Premier League, then they'd add to it again next summer. Of that, we have no doubt. And every season they stay up with the self-funded model, obviously, we hope we don't have another issue where there's a massive hole caused by a once in a century type event that drains millions and millions of pounds away that otherwise would have probably gone into the squad again. Then ultimately they'll be getting more expensive players and then more expensive players, and by doing that, you're just continually increasing the quality. And ultimately, that's what Stuart said to us. One of the things he said to us at the start of the summer, it was about thinning out the squad, and part of that is what we're seeing with the Kloses and all the other guys, but also raising the quality threshold so that Daniel can look around and, if Rashica isn't available, he's got Jolis. If Billy Gilmore doesn't play, he's got a Norman or a Lise Malou to throw into the mix. If now in defensive areas, the centre backs that you want to go with aren't available, then there are other options. And ultimately, Daniel didn't have that 2 years ago. We could all, with a fair win, certainly in the second part of the season, name that 1 to 11, because there wasn't really anybody else who could come in who was good enough to improve what he had. And let's be honest, that 11 wasn't good enough. So this time around, completely different. And that's why, the focus is going to shift to Daniel and what he can do with this group of players, because he's got the resource now to certainly be competitive and certainly to be far better than they were 2 seasons ago. But yeah, I think that is very much that group that they've assembled. You look at the age profile, there's only Lise Malou and Gibson, really, who are probably the other side of 25 of all those players who've come in. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any of the other ones. And that tells you, just simply looking at the age profile, that this is a group who could stay together for 2 seasons, 3 seasons. But then we all know how Premier League football works, certainly. But for now, that's, I'm sure, one of the facets driving what they've tried to do this window. But, ultimately, it's for that group to show that they're not just potential in the cases of Zolis or Sargent or Rashica, but they are actually, sooner rather than later, genuine Premier League grade players. And that's the excitement that we've got to come now, that we've got all these shiny new toys. Can Daniel put them together and put them on the park and put a cohesive team out that, as I said at the start, more often than not, can compete and can pick up points? Because it's not enough just to, as they did Saturday last, go toe-to-toe with Leicester for long spells, but then come out of it losing the game through really their own individual errors in 2 key transitional moments. We need to see not only the potential, but also start to see some productivity from these guys as well. And there'll be no better time to start than Arsenal the other side of the international break.
Exactly. We'll come to Daniel in just a moment and how he kind of puts all these pieces together. But we all put together our kind of 3 top signings this summer. We kind of ranked them. You can view that on pinkham.com. I think I went for Norman, Jolis and Kabak in that order, I think. I don't know who you gents went for. Dave, I think did you have Gilmore in your 3? No, you had Rashica in your 3, I think, didn't you?
Yeah, I had Norman as 1, Rashica 2 and Gilmore 3. Taking a little bit of a gamble with Gilmore perhaps, but I want to sort of show faith with the lad, because he's obviously got a lot of ability about him. It's not been the best of starts, but I'll be really intrigued to see what can happen if, for instance, Norman takes that slightly deeper role and he is playing in one of the slightly more advanced roles, because you can see he can pick out a pass and he can ping a pass. So he's got too much ability. We saw it in that England game at the Euros. He was exceptional that night, and it's not quite happened for him yet. But yeah, I think Norman for me is the pivotal one. But I like a lot of what we've seen from Rashica, and I think consistently over the season, I think we will see him contribute. And it's just he's not quite found his shooting boots yet, has he?
No, he hasn't. And on that front, well, I was going to extend that out and ask our viewers watching to maybe list their top summer signing from Norwich City, or if you want to name a top 3, go ahead and we'll flash some of them up. But Dave, I will bounce it back to you. You're Daniel Farker. I think Paddy's mapped out there compared to 2 years ago. The competition in the squad, the quality in the squad is significantly greater than it was. So how do you put all these shiny new toys together into kind of a cohesive working football team that is good enough to stay in the Premier League? That is now the big challenge that he has.
Yeah, that's the easy one, isn't it? And I think it does put an element of pressure on Daniel, because Stuart Webber's done his job now. The recruitment team have done their job. There's pretty much universal approval of the transfer work that they've done. Most people in agreement that Farker has now got the tools. He has got the arsenal to turn to try and get Premier League survival. And I think from this point, given that they've got a January transfer window where, I don't know, at this moment in time, I'm speaking off the top of my head, they may not have a great deal more funds to tweak. They've probably spent most of what's going to be available this season already, rather than holding anything back for January. But we'll see how that evolves. So I think if they were to be relegated from this point, it would be pretty much seen as a failure. And certainly if form doesn't really get going in the next 10 games, shall we say, then I think there's going to be questions asked as to whether Farke is getting enough out of the squad, with all the context of the disrupted pre-season and whatnot. But the actual shape of how it looks, I wonder if we will see Daniel gravitate back towards the 4-2-3-1, which is where the majority of his success has been built upon. It suits Cantwell and Dowell better. It almost feels like Dowell is surplus to requirements if you're going to play a 4-3-3, unless you're playing Bournemouth's reserves in the Cup, which he was more than capable of dealing with. Playing Leicester or Arsenal is a very, very different deal, isn't it? With Kabak, on top of what Pad said earlier, I think at least he gives you the option to play here at the back. And that's what I wanted to see at Manchester City. That they were on a hiding to nothing that day. There was incredibly small chance of them winning that game. And I would much rather have seen them not quite part the bus, because Daniel Farke is never going to do that, but to set up far more defensively and just do whatever you can to frustrate Manchester City, because I don't think they did that anywhere near enough. And, within 10, 15 minutes, the game was basically over, wasn't it? And they would have been, if they could have played through at the back, especially now they've got a player of Kabak's quality, I would have much preferred to see them try that. But just from everything we've seen from Daniel over the years, I don't think that's really something that he particularly fancies, because it takes away too much from the attacking threat. So I think we'll probably end up going towards 4-2-3-1. In the short term, maybe that's at least Malou and Norman. And you might even see Gilmour used as a 10. I don't know. We'll see how that evolves. But ultimately, if Jolis really gets going, I think the best attacking threat, particularly at home and against more direct rivals, is going to be Rashica, Cantwell, Jolis, and then Pukki, maybe Sargent. But I still think Pukki, if he gets himself going this season, that's your front four, which can do damage in the Premier League. And then it's about having a solid foundation behind them. And as long as you've got someone in who's maybe not the same as Skip, but has got the same mentality, or is asked to have the same unselfish mentality, where you are there to protect those centre-backs and to fill in the gaps when the full-backs go forward, because they will continue to go forward. They're Max Aarons and Yanulis or Williams, and Farke wants his full-backs to attack. Those central midfielders have got a big responsibility to making the whole team tick. And Kenny McLean's a good example of that, isn't he? How good he is in the air with defensive clearances at corners and things like that. Kenny is a pretty selfless player in terms of doing what is needed for the team. So the big thing is Daniel has got a lot of options. He's got a lot of variation available to him, and now he's got to find that solution. And he has got to find that solution. The form can't continue to be poor through until Christmas or anything, because that means they're going back to the Championship pretty much. They've got to find some solutions, and they've got to find them pretty quickly.
Yeah, and as people have already pointed out, it's going to be tough when he's signed Norman and Kabak. He's got those two available, but then they've immediately jetted off and headed out on international duty. So that makes the task a little bit tougher. And I mean, that front four that you were painting there is very exciting if we get to see that on the pitch at some point. We've had loads of comments about people's top three signings. There you go. It's a big call already from
very big call.
Chaz Tats, which is good to see. Neil has listed his top three of Rashica, Jolis, and Kabak. Very kind, Neil. Very kind. £5 is in the post. Don't you worry about that. Chaz Tats again has said Zolis is our best signing, in my opinion. Then Gilmour, then Kabak. Zolis is 19. Looks unreal. Farke can mould him into a quality player for us. Jake Tidy, I'll go backwards, but he said 3 Kabak, 2 Rashica, 1 Zolis. We have had a few more as well. Lee Coates, top 3, Norman, Solis, and Kabak, which seems to be auto-correcting to Kebab, because that seems to be in a lot of comments at the moment. So that's one for the phones to get used to. Phil has said top 3 signings: Daniel Farke, Jolis, and Rashica. So there you go, which is a good one to add. Yeah, Daniel Farke signed obviously his new 4-year deal. So Pad, let's come to you then. Let's say that Daniel Farke does get this going, or maybe doesn't. Maybe is a better way to frame it. How much pressure do you feel he will be under, given that Stuart Webber has this time? I think he described to Radio Norfolk saying that he had a gun, a couple of grenades, a bazooka, and they were just waiting for the tank. So if this is the tank arriving, And then he obviously feels that Daniel Farke's been very well equipped to produce a side that is good enough to stay in the Premier League. If that does not happen at this stage, where does that kind of leave Daniel Farke and maybe his Norwich City future? Do you think he'll be in a position where there will be questions asked of him because of the work they've done in this window? I mean, I'm looking ahead quite negatively, so let's hope it doesn't come to this situation, but hypothetically.
Yeah, let's hope it is hypothetically, Connor. Yeah, no, it's the manner of it. If they go down, but they've really, really, he's got an excellent tune out of that group, and it just isn't quite good enough. Then I don't think there would be anybody calling for his head if that's where we're going with this. If they've had a go, if they've been competitive, still even with this group of players, somebody said on social earlier on, the expense that Norwich is probably one or two players in the top 7 or 8 clubs when they do their business in a window. The differential is still massive. The gulf in terms of resource is still massive, and for those reasons, we need to remain fairly grounded about this, and that the objective is still to try and stay in the division. And the chances are better now than when they started this transfer window, 100%. But they're still up against it. There's no two ways about it, because I don't see 3 other teams who you would at this stage put below Norwich in terms of the squads or their potential to improve those squads. Even when the likes of Burnley going out and spending, what did they pay for that lad from Lyon? Was it about 15 million, the left back? Well, there you go. And that's Burnley, who supposedly in Project Restart were one of the clubs who were going to be pretty hard hit financially. So the fact that they can go out and do that on top of a group who have, under Dyche, serially stayed in the division, know what it's all about, know what it takes. And that's the sort of club, really, that Norwich are going to have to try and scramble above, that level of club in the Premier League pecking order. So, long-winded way of saying it, but if they fall just short, but they've really given it a good go and have been competitive, and there's maybe hope that they are getting a bit closer to sort of eventually staying up and pushing on, then for me, Farke would still be my man to take him on again. Now, whether it's a different debate, whether he'd want another go in the Championship, given he's already won 2 titles, he might feel, well, it's just not going to happen now, so I don't really want to go back to the Football League. He would clearly still, even with another relegation on his CV, he would still have offers, I'm sure, over the course of what he's done at Norwich in its entirety, and he might feel the time is right to go. The other imponderable, if we're talking about next summer, is still Stuart Webber and his contract situation. It's still, as it stands, ends next summer. And if that's the case and he's no longer here, then the dynamic shifts again, and quite dramatically if it's Stuart Webber leaving the club, let's be honest. So I think it's a bit premature to sort of hinge Norwich go down, Daniel Farke is departing. I don't think it's quite as black and white as that for so many reasons. But ultimately, what I would say to finish is, if they don't muster a better effort than they did 2 seasons ago, when, let's be honest, they were stanked the place out in the Premier League, they were so far adrift, it was by the end pitiful, really. And again, I accept that in the Project Restart with no fans and the impact at home Carrow Road crowds might have done down the stretch, you can't underestimate that. But they were so far short in terms of the squad, the quality of that squad. If he can't improve on that benchmark, then he won't be here, because Stuart Webber will not accept that. I'm pretty sure of that. So there's no doubt about it. He now needs to show Championship level. We can't doubt it now. He is a serially good Football League Championship level coach. Can he now go to the next level? We're talking about the players, and can they go to the next level? The same applies to Daniel and his backroom team. They need to prove now that they can operate at this level and operate even with all the stated self-funded restrictions or complications they have to deal with, that they still can be competitive at this level. And I think with this group of players now, that's the least we should expect.
It's going to be fascinating.
Sorry, I'm just going to have to jump in there, and without being too mysterious, you guys know that this was a potential story. There's another one breaking within the hour, so I'm going to have to break off and get that sorted. nothing too exciting, as you both know already. It's one of the we know that all the senior sort of first team business is done, so you can probably narrow it down to one of the younger players who it sounds like is going out on loan. But I'm just going to have to break off and get that confirmed, get the story sorted. But also got the evening news editor wanting a few answers as well. So I'll leave you boys to finish off the video and catch up with you in a bit.
Good stuff. Thank you, Dave. Thanks for joining us. A little bit of a spoiler there for you guys watching. We'll swap to that, and then hopefully we're all sorted. Pad, that just leaves us to finally then on a bit of a cheerier note. I was going to ask you for your deadline day stories, perhaps any memorable ones that you've got covering Norwich City in recent years. We've had a few. I guess Yannick Vilska is probably the best example because that was very, very late, wasn't it? But are there any sort of real others that stand out? I mean, Norwich City haven't well, I guess Harry Kane was quite late as well, wasn't it? Have you got any others beyond that deadline day story wise?
Ryan Bennett, you won't ever top Ryan Bennett. That was an 11 o'clock evening deadline. I think it was January off the top of my head, and I think probably 5 minutes to that buzzer getting pressed, we didn't have any wind of that at all. And then, funny enough, it was because he left from Peterborough. And it was the Peterborough end where we got a bit of confirmation that could be imminent. And then, as it turned out, what had happened is he was obviously in a car with his agent and going to Swansea earlier in the day. Brendan Rodgers, funnily enough, and then phone call to his agent Barry Fry, Peterborough's whatever he was then, director of football / everything bottle washer, told him to turn the car around and head to Norwich City's training ground, where they swept through the gates, I think, pretty late that evening, had to do all the medical and all the formalities. And then, as I say, the button got pressed. So purely from a journalistic point of view, 5 minutes from the window, you think, right, we can put our feet up now. There's nothing more likely to happen. And then all hell breaks loose, and it's changed. Dave just talking about evening news page requirements. It was rip up the back page, go again. And obviously you're on a deadline, print deadline, as much as a transfer window deadline. So that was a particularly fraught evening, I think. There's nothing that comes close to that. Maddison was a late one, another January. And late to the extent they couldn't, unlike with Ryan Bennett, they couldn't actually get him to Norwich to do his medical. It was that late. It was a David McNally signing. He actually had to, bear in mind he was Coventry based, he had to go to St George's Park in Burton, Staffordshire, and do his medical there. So, yeah, it kind of sells a lie to where we are today, certainly, or mainly in the Stuart Webber era, which is feet up, watching the other carnage unfold it round the other grounds. But I don't know about you, Connor, but I think that there's something gone out of deadline day from years gone by, where it was Robinho and Berbatov, late night dashes to various clubs, and obviously the fiasco with Peter Odd and Wingy, who could ever forget that, turning up at a rogue training ground to force through a move that nobody else seemed to know what was going on. So I think it's a far more serene operation these days, and particularly with Stuart Webber, because he, without breaking any confidences, absolutely despises the whole farce that goes with deadline day and breaking news left, right, centre. So hence why, of course, man true to his word, we're sat here on deadline day, and it's just Tim Klose leaving and maybe one or two other young lads going out on loan, rather than any back pages getting ripped up. So from a journalistic point of view, very happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was going to ask you. I mean, we've had someone message saying that David McNally used to tweet, didn't he, telling Norwich fans to go to bed. So
not every window, not every window, not every window,
not every window. But just to conclude, we're there, aren't we, for Norwich City wise, by those, as we kind of said right at the start, trimming of the edges. Yeah. In terms of major business, that's your lot, isn't it? And we've probably been saying that for the last 24 hours, really.
Spot on. Yeah, that is your lot. There'll be no like flight tracker needed tonight, put it that way.
Good stuff. Paddy, thank you very much. Thank you all very much for watching as well. I think throughout the last hour, we've had about 300 of you on all of our Pinken channels watching us live. So thank you very much for doing that. And this, of course, is the final window watch that you'll get this summer, which, of course, is incredibly emotional moment for everyone, I'm sure. And I'm sure you'll miss seeing our faces every week. But we'll still be doing the preview shows and looking ahead to all the Premier League fixtures with our various output. Pinken.com, of course, the place to go for all of the final bits of Norwich City's business this evening. 11 o'clock is the deadline, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens elsewhere and what other Premier League clubs get bits done between now and the deadline. Always a fraught few hours or so. Thank you very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of the what day is it today? Tuesday, bank holiday throws you a bit, and we'll see you again very, very soon.